This is Vasily Goloborodko, a fictional schoolteacher from the TV show Servant of the People, who accidentally becomes president of Ukraine after his rant against government corruption goes viral. As president, despite having zero political experience, he successfully takes on Ukraine's oligarchs and fights to end corruption. This is Volodymyr Zelensky, the man who plays Goloborodko. And just like the character from the TV show, he also becomes president of Ukraine, campaigning as an anti-establishment, anti-corruption outsider who will take on Ukraine's oligarchs. But has he actually done that? How successful have Zelensky's efforts been at fighting corruption and fixing Ukraine's fragile democracy? Does he live up to the character in the TV show? And will Ukraine emerge after this war as a stronger, less corrupt democracy than what it was before the war? In Ukraine, as part of the information war, multiple media outlets have been banned. The same thing has happened in Russia and the EU. If you want to overcome censorship and have free access to any media you want, consider signing up for ExpressVPN. With ExpressVPN, you can change your location and get unrestricted access to any news and media from anywhere in the world. So if you want to help out the channel and avoid censorship, as well as getting 3 months extra of ExpressVPN for free, go to expressvpn.com/mytake. Link in the description. Back to the video. A fragile democracy. To understand the challenge that Ukrainians and Zelensky face in consolidating their democracy during and after this war, we have to understand what Ukrainian democracy was like before the war. Much like Russia in the 1990s, Ukraine emerged out of the Soviet Union as an incredibly fragile democracy dominated by oligarchs. As state-owned companies were privatized, a handful of individuals with close connections to politicians used corrupt deals to purchase these state-owned companies for a fraction of their true value. By 2008, just 50 oligarchs controlled 85% of the economy. In order to protect their ill-gotten wealth and preserve their monopolies, these oligarchs began to use their money to influence the country's politics. Different oligarchic groups began backing different political parties by funding their campaigns. Sometimes they would fund multiple political parties at once. They would also use the media to promote politicians who supported their interests. Just 5 oligarchs controlled 2/3 of Ukraine's media. So even if you wanted to reform the system, you had to rely on an oligarch-controlled media to promote your message. In exchange for this support, politicians would implement policies and block reforms to protect the wealth of the oligarchs. Many oligarchs also received positions in parliament which would give them immunity from prosecution, and positions on party lists were sold to the highest bidder. But it also worked the other way. Politicians would selectively enforce regulations and tax laws on oligarchs they didn't like, while giving a free pass to the ones who supported them. But in 2000, Ukraine and Russia made a critical juncture. In Russia, the oligarchs never went away. Instead, they were simply made subservient to a new class of security men led by Putin called the Siloviki, and the country transitioned into an authoritarian state. That didn't happen in Ukraine. Rather than all the oligarchs being subservient to one man, instead there remained competition between the various oligarchic groups who supported different political factions. This ensured that no one group or individual could secure total power and establish an authoritarian state like in Russia. As a result of this oligarchic pluralism, even though the country's politics and media were heavily influenced by oligarchs, unlike in Russia, there were still open and competitive elections, civil liberties, and the possibility for democratic change. You see, Ukrainians did not remain passive, but what frustrated them was that even as dramatic political swings occurred, the oligarchic system remained stable. In 2004, Viktor Yanukovych, backed by pro-Russian oligarchs like Rinat Akhmetov and Dmitro Firtash, and supported by the Russian FSB, poisoned his pro-Western reformist opponent, Viktor Yushchenko, and rigged the 2004 election. Only mass protests forced the Supreme Court to overturn the result and force a rerun, which was won by Yushchenko. Yet once Yushchenko came to power, Ukrainians' hope for serious economic and social reforms were crushed. Many oligarchs simply switched sides to curry favor with the new administration. And once Yanukovych came to power in 2010, the oligarchs switched sides again. Billions were looted from the country, and corruption only grew worse under Yanukovych, which led to another revolution in 2014, which ousted Yanukovych. While the revolution and the start of the war in the Donbass forced out many of the pro-Russian oligarchs from Donetsk, other oligarchs continued to dominate the system. The new president who was elected in 2014, Petro Poroshenko, was an oligarch himself. He was the Willy Wonka of Ukraine, controlling most of the country's candy industry. And under Poroshenko, the pace of reform remained painfully slow. Something had to change. Someone had to change things. Enter Volodymyr Zelensky. Servant of the people. By 2019, just 23% of Ukrainians trusted their president, just 12% trusted their parliament, and just 12% trusted the courts. Ukrainians were desperate for someone who would shake up the political system and end the corruption. They were desperate for someone like Vasily Goloborodko. You see, from 2015 to 2019, there was a TV show called Servant of the People. In that show, a humble schoolteacher called Vasily Goloborodko accidentally becomes president after a video of him ranting against government corruption goes viral. Despite having zero political experience, as president he fights corruption and takes on the oligarchs who are secretly conspiring to bring him down. Goloborodko is played by none other than Volodymyr Zelensky. But the crazy thing about this TV show is the way it fused with real life. Because in 2018, while the TV show was still running, Volodymyr Zelensky, an actor and comedian with zero political experience, started his own political party called Servant of the People, named after the TV show, and announced that he was running for president. His campaign platform and rhetoric mirrored that of the TV show. Zelensky positioned himself as an outsider anti-establishment candidate and promised to end corruption, take on the oligarchs, negotiate with Russia to bring peace to the Donbass, and hold referendums on EU and NATO membership. His platform was vague and broad enough that it appealed to a wide range of people. In 2019, Ukrainians, tired of the corruption under Poroshenko, elected Zelensky in a landslide, winning 30% of the vote in the first round and 73% in the second round. While Poroshenko mainly won in the west of Ukraine, Zelensky, who is a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, won in the center and east. Immediately after, he called for snap parliamentary elections, and his party won 254 out of 450 seats. The first time any party won an outright majority in Ukraine's history. It was a clean sweep. While previous parliaments were dominated by the same set of oligarch-controlled career politicians, in 2019, 80% of the parliament were fresh faces with no political experience. But it's not as clean as it all seems. You see, Zelensky's TV show aired on a TV channel called 1+1, owned by Ukraine's fourth richest oligarch, Ihor Kolomoisky. On top of that, Kolomoisky's TV channels had supported Zelensky's campaign. So how much influence did Kolomoisky have over Zelensky's presidency, and was he able to implement real anti-corruption measures? The truth is somewhere in between. Zelensky managed to pass a law to remove immunity from lawmakers, diplomats, and judges, something which was previously exploited by corrupt politicians to get immunity from prosecution. He also introduced a law updating Ukraine's referendum laws. But one of his most important achievements was the de-oligarchization law. This law creates an official list of the country's oligarchs and bans them from donating either directly or indirectly to any political parties. This law also bans them from participating in the privatization of state-owned companies. Remember, most of the oligarchs got rich through corrupt deals that involved the privatization of state-owned companies. This law is the first step to eliminate the oligarchs' influence over politics, as well as preventing them from acquiring more state assets. As for his links to Ihor Kolomoisky, it turned out that Zelensky was no puppet. Back in 2016, Ukraine's largest bank, Privatbank, a bank owned by Kolomoisky, was nationalized because he committed bank fraud to the tune of $5.5 billion. In 2020, Zelensky passed a new bank law that prevented Kolomoisky and other oligarchs from being able to regain control over banks that had previously been nationalized. In 2020, Kolomoisky was indicted in the US for bank fraud, and in July 2022, Zelensky stripped Kolomoisky of his Ukrainian citizenship while nationalizing some of his assets. Clearly, Zelensky had no trouble going after oligarchs who supported his campaign. Yet despite these anti-corruption measures, corruption remains a persistent problem. In January 2023, 4 deputy ministers, 5 regional governors, and 1 top advisor were forced to resign and arrested in the face of corruption allegations. This is Deputy Infrastructure Minister Vasyl Lozinski. He was arrested after taking $350,000 in bribes. This is Deputy Defense Minister Vyacheslav Shapovalov, who bought military food supplies at inflated prices. I'm sure he received no kickbacks whatsoever. This demonstrates 2 things: that Zelensky is unable to control corruption even within his own cabinet, but also that Ukraine's anti-corruption agencies are working effectively to actually expose these people. As for Zelensky himself, the Pandora Papers revealed that before he became president, he co-owned a network of offshore companies in tax havens like Cyprus and the British Virgin Islands, which were used to buy 3 expensive London properties. Now, before he became president, he did hand over his shares in those companies to a business partner, but a company owned by his wife continued to receive dividend payments from these companies. While offshore companies are not illegal in and of themselves, this reeks of hypocrisy for a so-called anti-corruption crusader. This paints a mixed picture. Zelensky is pursuing real anti-corruption and de-oligarchization measures, but he has had difficulty in eliminating corruption when it comes from his own allies, and continues to maintain assets in tax havens. At the same time, while he is fighting the power of oligarchs, in many ways he has been consolidating power towards himself instead. That last part has become a more serious issue in the context of the war. Wartime President. On 27 April 1861, US President Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, allowing the government to arrest anybody at will without trial, a complete violation of the Constitution. He also introduced widespread censorship, a violation of the First Amendment. But the context is important. America was in the middle of a civil war, and emergency measures were needed to stop the secessionists and prevent the spread of Confederate propaganda. As the war came to an end, Lincoln forced the Southern states to endorse the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which abolished slavery and gave citizenship, equal rights, and the vote to Black Americans. These measures could be described as authoritarian, but they were necessary to win the war and build a healthier democracy after it ended. It is with this lens that we should critically analyze the authoritarian measures taken by Zelensky since February 2022. On the 24th of February 2022, Zelensky declared martial law, granting him emergency powers. In March, he used those powers to suspend a dozen pro-Russian political parties. Most of those parties were small and had no seats in parliament, but one of the parties which was banned was the Opposition Platform for Life party, the second largest party in the country, which won 13% of the vote, winning 43 seats. That's a significant share of Ukrainian public opinion. But looking deeper into it, it begins to make sense. This party is the direct successor to the party of Viktor Yanukovych, and one of its key leaders is Viktor Medvedchuk, a pro-Russian oligarch who is a close friend of Vladimir Putin. On the same day of the invasion, a member of parliament for the party, Ilya Kiva, openly expressed support for the Russian invasion. Medvedchuk and Kiva were charged with treason and fled to Russia. Now, the party did later remove these men from the party and condemned the invasion on the 7th of March, 2 weeks after it started. In this context, it makes sense that parties with members with direct links to the Kremlin should not be allowed to operate in a war situation. But it does raise a question. The Opposition Platform for Life party received 1.9 million votes in 2019, representing 13% of Ukrainians, mostly from the non-occupied parts of Donetsk and Luhansk. While it's clear that parties with links to the enemy should not be allowed, what kind of pro-Russian positions will be allowed in a post-war war Ukraine, especially if that Ukraine includes areas like Crimea and the Donbass. Surely there's a difference between openly supporting the enemy and, for instance, wanting Russian to be taught in schools in Russian-speaking regions. After all, policies like that are clearly supported by millions of Ukrainians, especially in the East. Will parties espousing such policies be allowed to run in the future, given that they represent the desires of millions of Ukrainian people? That's a real concern for Ukrainian democracy, whether you agree with such parties or not. Similarly, Zelensky forcibly merged all TV stations into one outlet and introduced widespread censorship, including the power to suspend media outlets without a court decision. Again, an important aspect of the war is the information war. You simply cannot allow the propaganda of the enemy to spread within your country. In the United States during World War I, there was censorship even though the war was not being fought on American soil. But in Ukraine, it is. Still, this poses a potential danger. How long will these censorship laws last, and will they be lifted once the war is over? What's more is that these measures come on top of previous attempts at censorship from before the war. Back in 2020, Zelensky introduced a new media law aimed at loosening the control of the oligarchs over the media and fighting disinformation. But many aspects of this law could easily be used for censorship. The law allowed the National Television and Radio Broadcasting Council to fine media groups, revoke media licenses, and block online outlets from publishing certain information. This could potentially be abused against journalists trying to publish information on corruption. And that's the most important challenge for Ukraine. How can it ensure that it doesn't lose its democracy in the process of fighting this war, and how can it prevent going back to the corrupt oligarchic politics from before the war? A democratic awakening. If the Ukraine that emerges after this war is independent, but corrupt and authoritarian, then the Ukrainians will have achieved nothing. After all, a corrupt authoritarian regime is what awaited them had they been annexed by Russia. Zelensky is a war hero, but he is far from perfect. Unfortunately, real life is not like a TV show, and while Zelensky has made substantial efforts to fight corruption and the oligarchs, he too needs to be held accountable to the promises he made. No one man can root out pervasive corruption and an entrenched oligarchy. What is needed is a societal effort. That means that even in these times of war, civil society and investigative journalists should hold their government accountable and root out and expose corruption where it finds itself. Reduced censorship is needed to enable journalists to expose corruption. Reform of the judicial system is needed to ensure that the corrupt are prosecuted, and e-government and digitalization are needed to ensure that government processes run transparently. At the same time, the Ukrainian citizenry must stay alert to how power is used, even in a war situation. While it goes without saying that emergency powers and some authoritarian measures are necessary during a war, Ukrainians should be wary not to let power be abused and concentrate in one man, even if that man is Zelensky. Yes, even presidents with a 90% approval rating should be held with suspicion. In fact, especially presidents with a 90% approval rating should be held with suspicion. There is also a role for the EU and Western powers. These powers hold leverage over Ukraine, both through the continuous infusions of military aid and the prospect of EU membership. It cannot be that money going to support the liberation struggle in Ukraine is stolen or misused by corrupt officials. The EU and US should place conditionalities on funds sent to Ukraine to put pressure on Zelensky to root out corruption and ensure that these funds are used for their intended purposes. And this has worked well in the past. Back in 2015, a key bill to regulate campaign finance only passed because it was a condition of the EU's visa liberalization process. The latest EU aid package, worth 18 billion euros, is partially conditional on further rule of law reforms. After all, the continuation of this aid depends on the goodwill of democratic majorities in the West. If American and European voters see that corruption remains a problem in Ukraine, then support for continuing aid to Ukraine will collapse, and with it, the war effort. What is needed is a sandwich approach. If the West can put pressure from the top and Ukrainian civil society and journalists can put pressure from the bottom, then Ukrainian leaders will both be incentivized and empowered to take on the vested interests that hold back Ukrainian democracy. This is the impossible challenge facing Ukraine and Zelensky. Ensuring that the country does not return to the corrupt oligarchic politics of the past or slip into the seductive lure of strongman politics while building a democratic future that is worth fighting for. What would a potential collapse of Russia look like? Find out in this video. Don't forget to get ExpressVPN and get 3 months extra free. Consider becoming a Patreon to support the channel. Leave a comment for the algorithm. Thank you to my Patreons including Linda, Richard and many more for making this video possible. Like, share and subscribe. Because this was my take.